All right, so part 3 of today's lecture is a little bit bigger. We're going to tackle now language standard 6. And so as you can see from language standard 6, this is really all encompassing. So now students are going to acquire and use. So they're going to receive certain words and use certain words accurately, and a range of general academic, which I'm going to call tier 2, and domain specific words, which I'm going to call tier 3, and phrases. And that those words need to be, again, developed and acquired and used for reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And so students, again, are going to be reading words, and they need to have a robust vocabulary to process what they're reading. Students are also going to be writing and speaking in your class, and you want to get them developing the tier 2 and the tier 3 vocabulary that's required for them to learn and to be, again, college and career ready. And so they also need to demonstrate independence in gathering vocabulary knowledge. That goes back to standard 4, right? And so those vocabulary strategies when encountering an unknown term important to comprehension or expression. So language 6 is really kind of the, if I had to pick on, not pick on, but kind of give an example that would relate to my math folks. This is kind of like standards 1 through 5 equal standard 6, right? And so that's really what you're trying to accomplish here with standard 6. So last week we talked about this idea of instructional approaches, that often people take a more incidental approach, much like I was kind of describing in lecture 1 today, where I've come across a word I don't know, and so in the moment I have some strategies to try to learn the words that I don't know in the moment. Versus a more systemic approach where I'm creating a word bank and targeting certain vocabulary words and trying to develop and help those students acquire and use those words in my class. And so instead of giving you just a bunch of just like loose, unconnected standards, I'm actually going to provide you a framework for teaching this kind of vocabulary or meeting this kind of standard within your content area that I think will be really helpful for you to follow as you teach throughout a unit, and as you support your students in acquiring the vocabulary they need. So I'm going to center my vocabulary, and just so you're aware, if you want to do this exercise, which you should do with me, on the CalTPA vocabulary. So that's the vocabulary you should be learning right now. So I'm going to treat you again like I've always done in teacher education. You are now students, and as you go through this process as a student, you can see kind of how this process works and what you can do to replicate it as a teacher for your own students. And so if you just type in Google CalTPA, you'll get to the CalTPA page. I'm sure you've been here before. You click assessment materials right here, and you see down here the CalTPA glossary. So if you want to get more familiar with the tier 3 vocabulary of your discipline, and for this program, feel free. But I'm only going to use one today. Just going to use one example from that glossary and walk you through as a student this kind of framework for developing vocabulary within your classroom. It's taken from a person named MARZANO. MARZANO is a very big name in education. He's developed a 6-step process for teaching vocabulary. And that process is simple, right? So on the day you introduce the vocabulary, you notice here on my right-hand side of the chart, you are going to provide a description, explanation, or example of the new term you're trying to teach. I'll do that here momentarily. Same day, you're also going to ask students to restate that description or explanation or example in their own words. Because again, they have to start using the vocabulary they have to integrate the new vocabulary they're trying to learn. And as they do so, it makes stronger connections in the brain, and they're able to retain those new words. You also want to ask students to construct a picture, pictograph, symbolic representation of that term on the day that you introduce the term. So if you notice, those 3 steps could take 5 minutes, right? Let's say you introduce 2 or 3 new words a day or in your lesson that day. That's not going to take very long. You have them come in, you do a warm-up, you introduce some of these new words, have them restate it really quickly, and then draw a picture in a vocabulary journal that you might have them keep. This is not going to take long, which is great because sometimes teaching vocabulary feels like, oh, I have to stop teaching what I really want to teach so I can teach these kids the vocabulary they need. It should be very simple and an easy way to integrate it into your content area instruction. And so those are the first 3 steps. Now, once that's done, don't expect that your students are just going to have now mastered the word, right? Especially if you then say, okay, I'm just going to give a multiple choice test, and if they remember the words, great. It's not about remembering, right? It's about acquiring and using. And so we want to keep this process ongoing. That's where the next 3 steps come in. You engage students periodically in activities that help them add to their knowledge of their terms in their vocabulary notebooks, right? So, and I'll give you a few of those different activities. These can be different warm-ups on different days. Okay, we're going to review these words. We're going to do an activity to review these words. Fifth step, you want to periodically, again, over the course of your unit, as you're helping them acquire and use this vocabulary, have them just stop and discuss the terms with one another. Have a conversation and make sure you're using these words. And then finally, what's most fun is play some games. Students don't want to just learn vocabulary words for vocabulary words' sake. Play some authentic, relevant, real-world type of activities and games. Make it a competition. Especially middle schoolers, they love this. Any really adolescent does. So playing games to get them engaged in word learning is always kind of a fun and engaging process here. So these are the 6 steps. So I'm going to go through each step and give you some strategies for doing that. So at this moment is where you're going to start being a student, right? So pretend I'm now going to teach you new vocabulary and you are the student, which in this case you are. So step 1, I'm going to provide a description, explanation, or example of the new term. And the new term that we're going to focus on today is Standard English Learner. And I did this on purpose because for the Cal TPA, so many students, so many teacher candidates that engage in the Cal TPA fundamentally misunderstand what this word means. And then it really hurts them in terms of their score. And I don't want that to happen to you. So I'm going to define it for you. A standard English learner is a student for whom standard English is not native and whose home language differs in structure and form from standard and academic English. Now, this might make you think, oh, that sounds like an English learner. And it does, but the standard English learner, let's talk about denotation here, and an English learner, slightly different in nuance, right? So an English learner can be someone from Mexico or from South America or from Europe, Asia, that has come to this country and are now learning the English of our country, the mainstream academic English of our country. A standard English learner, as you can see from my example, are people that speak Pidgin English, Creole English, Cajun English, Bayou, right, etc., that have English as a form of their language, what's mixed with other kind of languages, and they've developed this kind of new version of English. And those people are what the state is defining as a standard English learner. So with that said, now you can see I'm going to transition nicely to step 2. So ask students to restate the description, explanation, or example in their own words. So pause the video, write it down, go talk with a friend, restate that description, explanation, or example in your own words. If we were in a synchronous class, I would have you share that with me, and we will down the road. But this is that moment to have you just stop and explain. So go ahead and pause the video, take a few minutes to just make sure you understand that word in your own words. Okay, so moving forward now, we're going to go to step 3. Now I'm going to ask you to construct a picture or pictograph or a symbolic representation of the term Standard English Learner. And this is just mine as an example. So I love the Disney movie Princess and the Frog. It's one of my favorite movies. And Ray is a person who speaks, now granted the movie does it a little bit better than probably a real standard English learner who speaks Cajun English, but they throw in a few of that Cajun English a bit. And so I give you some context here for that, right? Go to bed, right? Like that's kind of an idiom in Cajun English that is something that's unfamiliar to us. Using y'all, round, just different ways in which Ray speaks and highlights that kind of Cajun English shows that he is a standard English learner. If he was to go to a school and have to learn content in standard English form, he might need some support. There may be some terms in the ways that we speak where he might not fully understand. And so when I think of standard English learner, I immediately think of Ray. And then that gives me kind of that concept for this term. So I want you to stop for a second and do the same. Pick a picture, construct a picture, make that connection for yourself on what a standard English learner is to you. Okay, moving on. Now in step 4, I've done those first 3 steps, really first day I've introduced this word. So now we're done. You kind of got the word. I'm going to start teaching and doing instruction. But I need to reinforce that vocabulary for other tasks that you might have. You might have other readings that include that word. We might continue to talk about that word in class. You might have to write a paper or have a discussion using that word. And so I need to, again, engage you in these periodic activities to help you become familiar or enrich yourself with that word. And so here are some strategies. We've got the FRAYER model, exclusion brainstorming, word sorting, and word walls. And I'm going to walk you through them very quickly. And then I'm going to have you use one of these activities to reinforce your understanding of standard English learners. So the FRAYER model you've probably seen before. Might have students just pop out really quickly for a warm-up. put down standard English learner, write their definition that they currently understand. But then now, as we've been doing some readings and we've been doing some talking and we've been doing some other kinds of things, there might be some more examples that they're starting to form in their mind, some more non-examples and some characteristics. And so this FRAYER model would be kind of an ongoing strategy, right? So I've got this in a vocabulary notebook, I've introduced this new word, and as we are engaging in different activities in class, I'm going to constantly be referring back to it. And this should enrich students' vocabulary knowledge intentionally, and which is, again, what we've talked about before, that intentionality is so important. Exclusion brainstorming is a little bit of just of a fun activity. This can even be kind of down in step 6 as a game, right? So you essentially give students a bunch of different words that you might be focusing on in your class as a quick warm-up, and having them begin to sort and differentiate between these words. So these are all different words from the CalTPA. What you would do in this activity is take these words and begin to sort them. Which ones kind of belong to a certain category and which ones would you exclude from belonging to that category? So if we had a bunch of words related to standard English learner, or even if you had your entire word bank, this might be good, right? To just say, okay, let's come to class. We've been focusing on these words. I want you to do an exclusion brainstorming. And you give them a bunch of words that are related and unrelated, and have students try to sort in their mind and build these schemas in their mind. Which words seem to be related and why, and which words don't seem to be related and why. And then you could take a couple examples. Hey, Javier, why don't you share what your group came up with? And then it reinforces thinking of the group as well as thinking of others. It's just a really rich word learning activity. Word sorting is much like exclusion brainstorming, except this time they're not doing exclusion as much as they are actually categorizing the words. And so you could do the exact same thing. I've got this big word bank, or maybe a chunk of that word bank we've been focusing on. I want you now to sort these in your vocabulary journals today as a quick warm-up. Just again, look at your words, create the categories, share which categories you use, and then that would lead you again to a word wall, where you can put that up on a word wall. Word walls, as I'm showing you, they need to be interactive. If they're not interactive, there's no point on having a word wall. Word walls need to be something that you're constantly, they can be the unit wall for these are the words we're going to be focusing on for this particular unit of instruction. And then students are constantly referring back to it. They're looking at those words, they're changing those words, they're manipulating those words, they're just doing things to making sure they're enriching their understanding of those words. And so word walls, while may be often seen in elementary school, I've seen some effective word walls used in secondary schools, where teachers might have, like you see with the fried words, right? This was done in an English classroom to try to get students to kind of get away from the unclear, very cliche, nuanced, or not nuanced, but cliche words of saying and describing things like this is big, this is bad, this is happy, and giving them, again, a more robust way and precise way to describe certain emotions. That's an effective way, one, right? And so you can kind of brainstorm and think of that. So I think we're at a point, before I get to the next one, I'm going to go back. So I want you just to stop the video, and I want you to think, one, as a teacher, what strategy might I use to help my students have these kind of periodic activities? And why don't you do one? Obviously, word wall is not something I'm expecting you to do right now, but maybe go back and try word sorting or exclusion brainstorming or the FRAYER model with the word standard English learner. And see, for example, if you did like a word sort, how many different standard English learners are there, right? Like maybe stop and do a little research on that and then sort them and try to figure out the different types of standard English learners. Might help you enriching your understanding of that word. So go ahead and pause, participate in an activity. Okay, back to the model, step 5. So now periodically you're going to ask students to discuss the terms with one another. It's not just enough for them to receive the words, they have to be able to produce the words. So really quickly you could be in class, it's just part of your natural content area learning. Okay, we're going to have you get in groups now, you're going to discuss this task, but don't forget besides doing this discussion and besides focusing on the content area task, I also want you to use these 3 words as you're discussing. So when I'm going around, I'm going to be listening and I might encourage you, use that word, use that word. The more they use the word, it becomes a part of the vocabulary. And then they have started to now internalize this process. They've internalized these words and they're starting to really master these words. They become a part of who they are, the way they speak, and what they understand. And so that's really starting to get to the bread and butter. So again, I'm in class, got a quick content activity that I'm going to have them turn and talk or have them work collaboratively in groups, but just encourage them in those groups. Use these words that we've been focusing on. use them correctly, right? Help, and with peers, right? You can motivate or empower peer groups to be like, peers, check each other. Hey, I don't know if that word's the way that's supposed to be used. I would use it this way. And so again, just really richly trying to integrate these words into the content area that you're teaching, or the content you're teaching. And then last but not least, play a game, right? And so games are fun. And so these can be little warm-ups, these can be little closing activities. Heck, they could even be your assessments, right? We're gonna play a little game to assess your understanding of these words instead of just a multiple choice test. And you could do things like memory, right? So like, let's pull out the memory game, go ahead and match the terms with the words. Once you get them matched, you know, you've done your assessment. Or you could play charades, right? Like, you have students get together really quick and say, okay, you know, these are the 5 vocabulary words we've been focusing on this week. Why don't you go ahead and play charades with one another? This should be like a quick closing 5-minute activity, or even an opening warm-up where students are acting out the words and people are trying to guess what those words are. Again, reinforces their schema and understanding of the word. My game of 5 vocabulary activity is a really fun game where you essentially have students write the word out, but they're doing it now in a much more sophisticated way. So they're gonna write an example of the word in context. Let me take that back. They're gonna write a sentence of the word in the context of that sentence, but the purpose is not just to write it for like defining it or, you know, writing that sentence for just an academic purpose. They actually have to write it to make people laugh, right? And so if you think about standard English learner, okay, I have to write standard English learner in a sentence to try to get other students to laugh, right? Or to put a creative spin on the usage of that word. That takes higher level thinking, but it also really strengthens students' understanding of the word, and it allows them now to use the word for different purposes. So that's kind of a fun game, and you can play that with students as well. So I think at this point, that is the 6-step process. So I'm just gonna go back and just review one more time these 6 steps, as you can see here, right? So first day you introduce them, provide an example of the new word, have students restate the word, and have students construct a picture. And then ongoing throughout your teaching of that particular unit in which those words exist, you want to engage students periodically in different activities like the FRAYER model, word sorting, exclusionary brainstorming. You want to ask students to have discussions in class and to use that vocabulary. And then for assessment purposes possibly, have students play some games. And as you do this 6-step process, and it's so fun when we used to do this in class, you start to see that students, you, at this point, probably really would have picked up on the term standard English learner. You really would have mastered that word, and you see that this process works. It is effective. It has been researched to work, and that's what I want to teach, are strategies for you to take into your classroom that are easy to apply and work, and that's what I want for all of you. So if there are questions, by all means, reach out, come to office hours if you want to re-clarify some of these. But take some of the strategies you've learned from your peers, take some of the strategies that you've learned from me about addressing those standards, and begin to apply them this week in your student teaching. Or for those of you that don't student teach, you will get a chance to apply them pretty soon when you teach in this class. Thanks.